Well, we've gone from the Saskatchewan Advantage to transformational change, and most recently to a projected billion-dollar deficit. Now a new sitting kicks off at the Legislature today, and we do know the province's finances will be a major theme. Jason Childs is an associate professor in economics at the University of Regina, and he joined me in studio. Hello there.
Good morning.
So what kind of a session are you expecting, Jason?
Well, it should be kind of exciting if you like a little bit of the drama of politics. I think there's going to be a lot of that.
Where are we going to see most of the drama?
I think a lot of it's going to be around the deficit and trying to figure out whose fault it is and what to do about it.
Whose fault is it?
It's everybody's fault. It's natural resource revenue. You can blame it on the Saudis if you really want to point the finger somewhere. But a lot of this is just natural resource revenue and part of the cycle.
Well, tell me more about that, about to what extent it is beyond provincial control.
Well, when you look at the forecast, you go back to the 2014-15 budget, they were forecasting about $2.6 billion in non-renewable resource revenues. Most recent budget forecasts about $1.5 billion. So that's a big hit. And that money's going to come from somewhere. And the problem was we were spending that money on programming rather than banking it or building up a heritage fund, taking sort of the Norwegian approach. We spent it. So.
And you're saying that was unwise. We should.
Well, I mean, it's always a political challenge, right? Could you imagine the provincial government of the day saying to nurses when they wanted that big pay raise, "No, you're not going to get it. We're going to put the money in a savings account." I can't see that going over very well. So it's always one of these juggling acts and challenges for any government that's dependent on natural resource revenues is how to manage that unsteady flow.
Yeah. And when you talk about the nurses, you look back at that, and what was it? Was 38% over
something
4
like
years
that.
or
it was
something.
This phenomenal increase.
And then you had all the other healthcare unions and other unions lining up saying, where's my
ours?
money?
Yeah.
So in hindsight, how should that have been handled?
That's the really tricky question. I would have liked to have seen them take a slower, more smoother approach to it and rather than this one big pay bump. But at the same time, politically, could they have withstood a nurses' strike? What would that have looked like? Were the people willing to put up with one? I don't know that we were. And, so then we end up in a situation where the nurses get legislated back to work or something like that. I can see that just being an absolute disaster.
So the nurses are among those who are getting ready to negotiate again. What do you expect to see when it comes to all these contracts coming up?
I think they've made that pretty clear that they're looking for a zero total package. So not necessarily cuts in wages for many groups, but no increase in remuneration, no increase in pay whatsoever. So that whole pay envelope is going to stay the same size.
Do you see a period of labor unrest?
Absolutely. I think you're seeing it gearing up. Some of the ads being run by SGU and others, they're priming the pump. They're getting ready for some really hard negotiations and potentially labor disruption.
What else do you expect to see in the budget?
I think we're going to see a deficit. There's going to be an acceptance of deficits going forward for a few years anyway. This is, $1.2 billion, which is the most recent number that's been kicked around, it's a big number. It's $1,000 per person in the province. At the same time, it's only about 8% of the provincial budget and about 1.5% of the whole GDP in the province. So it's not an unmanageable situation. It's not an absolute crisis.
What about the rate at which it was growing, though?
Well, again, that's when you lose $1.1 billion in natural resource revenue, you're not going to make that up in a heartbeat. You're not going to make that up quickly. So, yeah, the deficit has grown rapidly, and that's because of the softness in natural resource pricing.
Have we reached a peak deficit, so to speak, or do you expect that kind of growth of the deficit to continue?
I don't think we're going to see that kind of growth. I think we may be, if we're not at the bottom, at the peak deficit, if you will, we're pretty close to it. I mean, when you look at the overall economy starting to tick up again, oil prices have moved in a positive direction. We're starting to see economic activity pick up and accelerate, particularly in areas like Weyburn. They're hiring, they're advertising quite aggressively. The Evraz plant is looking like it's going to put on new shifts and things like that. So
is that for pipeline?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah. I won't speak for Evraz, but I would be surprised if they didn't. So I think we're seeing economic activity pick up, and that's a good sign for the revenue. That's a good sign on the government revenue side. The expenditure side is going to be driven in part by the downturn. So as the economy picks up, some of that expenditure side will soften a little bit. It'll be a little easier on that side. But, you're not going to close this hole very quickly, and you're not going to do it without some discomfort.
What are some other, besides labor, what are some other ways to close that hole that either should be looked at or that you think are being looked at?
I think if you take them at their word, then everything's being looked at, and revenue's got to be part of the equation. So I would not be surprised to see a PST increase, to see a de-indexing of income tax brackets, to see the end of a number of tax expenditures, so tax deductions being canceled or rolled back. All those things I think are going to be in the mix. So they're going to have to generate more revenue somehow. Fees are going to go up, I'm sure. And we're also going to have to see some spending cuts. How
long do you think the tougher times are going to continue? Do you expect to see some kind of turnaround when it comes to non-renewables?
I think we're already starting to see it. Oil's moved up quite a bit in the last 6 months, a year.
Potash
is still quite soft, but I think they're close to the bottom. It depends on what the Russians and the Belarusians do. Uranium, again, it depends on what the users decide to do. If we continue to see this shift away from nuclear in various parts of the world, then we're in trouble. If China gets serious about reducing CO2 emissions, and one of the ways they decide to do that is nuclear, then there's some positive signs there. So, this is part of a cycle. Natural resources have always been on this cycle, and this is just, we were enjoying it for a long time. Now we got to suffer through the bad times.
But it sounds like you're saying we're not as hooped as people might think.
No, this is not catastrophic. The sky is not falling. It's not time to go full Chicken Little. This is a relatively small deficit. If you look at European countries, for example, this would be considered a minor issue, right? Remember, the deficit, we're talking $1.2 billion. That's only about 1.5, maybe 2% of GDP at the most. It's not huge, but it is important. I mean, this is $1,000 per person, so it is a big number, but it's not that big relative to what we produce.
All right. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.